We're going to make a bit of a transition that might feel abrupt after that lovely setting. So hold on to your seats. He's a real nowhere man, sitting in his nowhere land, making all his nowhere plans. Doesn't have a point of view, knows not where he's going to. Isn't he a bit like you and me? Okay, tell the truth. Were you one of those screaming people in 1964? One? We got one. When the Beatles came out, my dad thought it was the end of the world. He thought the communists were taking over, and they were all behind the Beatles. It was all about them. But, I don't know how you feel about the Beatles' influence on music or, our way of thinking. But every now and then, I think in some of their lyrics, they actually got some things pretty right. And this song is a great example to me of something I think they got pretty right. They tapped into something that's true about us when they said there's a nowhere man sitting in a nowhere land, making nowhere plans for nobody, doesn't really know where he's going. And I could say that is probably true for many people today. Many people in America could make those same statements. But here's the part I love about what they said. They talked about, well, here's a problem. But then they said, well, there's something better at the end. You don't know what you're missing, nowhere man. There's something more. I think it was their way of saying, there really is a winning life out there. There's a life worth living if you know how to find it and you'll step into it. So last week we looked at a life worth living, and we looked at the passage in Philippians chapter 1, those verses, very interesting verses from Paul where he says, for me to live is Christ, to die is gain. Don't know which one's the better. How do I sort that out? And he comes out at the end saying, well, it's better that I stay around. So that was our passage last week. And if you want to look that up and read it for yourself, I'm not going to put it on the screens, but you can check that out as we're working through the message today. When Paul's trying to sort out what's the best thing for him to do, how should I live, I think he started thinking about there's some nowhere people out there, but I care about them and I want to do something for them. So the balance was, I need to live today, because for me to live is Christ. It means the story of Jesus Christ gets told. He would say Christ gets preached. In other words, he's thinking, I can be part of expediting somebody's joy and faith. I can help that along, and that's a wonderful thing. So for Paul, it was about being in the world of the living right now, which meant everything about Jesus. I'm going to be living now because all my life needs to be somehow portraying or speaking about Jesus. I want to exalt Jesus in that way, and therefore let people know what is going on in the center of my life, which is Jesus Christ. So Charlotte read today the passage out of Hebrews. Those two verses, I still told Charlotte, they're Paul verses, so they're very long. There's just two verses, but it was like 4 screens of text up there. But it's interesting to hear those words, because what the passage is talking about, it's elaborating on this idea of a life worth living. It's elaborating on a life with Christ at the center. And what does that look like? It looks like Christ is our focus. It looks like Jesus is as a real goal for our lives, maybe even a chief desire. We desire lots of things, but the writer's saying, God, your chief desire really needs to be about Jesus Christ, that center part of our mind, our heart, our body, our soul. Everything that we do, every breath, is somehow related to giving glory to Jesus Christ. And the writer of Hebrews would say, as we run this race marked out for us, Charlotte just read these words, we lay aside, and I've kind of changed the words here, we lay aside the shadow of sin, wants to grab hold of us. Sin's brokenness is like that debris I talked about, wants to get in our way. Want to lay that aside, and some of the cultural pulls and pushes on us, those distractions, so that we can look straight ahead. We see very clearly and focus our eyes on Jesus. So that was sort of a motivation for Paul. A Christ-centered life meant a motivated life. Being here, right now, engaged for Jesus Christ. Now, we left off last week with sort of I hoped it was a bit of a cliffhanger question for you, which is how does this motivated life that Paul certainly is keyed into, how does this motivated life make a difference for those of us right here in this worship or anybody for that matter? How can we get a hold of this motivation for ourselves? So today I want to go into that as we get ready for the table. To the short answer of that is that we're necessary. If you want to remember only one thing I say today, and I'm going to say it as many different ways as I can, is that you're necessary. We all count to God, especially when our lives exalt Jesus Christ. And there's many ways that can happen. And that's quite a contrast, I think, to this idea of a nowhere man in the Beatles song. The Beatles say, this guy's a bit like you and me. And they're right, but they're not permanently right. And that's the beauty of the Christian faith and of the church, is we can tell a story that says, well, you may feel that way, but it's not the end of the story. There is something more. So as I said, Paul's motivated to exalt Jesus Christ in life right now and not just later in death. He says, well, that's good. I know how to do that too, and that'll be wonderful. But he said it's more necessary right now for me to be here for you. It was necessary for him to fight on. And, he had some hard circumstances. When Paul is writing these words, I want you to think about this now. He's in prison. He's in jail. He'd been beaten. He knows probably Rome has had it up to here with him, and they're tired of these Christian troublemakers. And you see that really come out in the year around 70 A.D. when they completely wipe out Jerusalem and destroy the temple. They'd had it with troublemakers, and Paul was one of the leading troublemakers. And so Paul understands he's in jail. Probably it's likely he's thinking, they're going to kill me. That's what's going on. Yet he says, it's more necessary. I need to fight on. I need to fight on. In fact, the same's true for us. We have hardships too, but our lives can exalt Christ to somebody else. And you may think that's not possible, and we're going to talk about it a little bit more as I go along in this message, but we can help raise a joyless, nowhere person to a joy-filled life in Christ too. It's available. So Paul is in that message last week, he's like a big scale of justice. Which way do I stay or do I go? And the balance tips in favor of what was more necessary. To the people he loved, he looked around and he said, I love these people. I love these folks in the church. I love what they're trying to do. I want to stay and I want to continue to help on their behalf. Paul saw his necessity, right? He was necessary in their faith journey. And I don't want you to say those are words of antiquity. They're 2,000 years old. That was a different setting. It's not that much different than our church right now. It's not very much different than Markham Woods, this community of faith, than you might be thinking. But I know what you might be thinking is what I hear all the time. I'm not Jesus. You're giving me all these highfalutin things to do. I'm not Paul. I'm not Billy Graham. I'm not Andy Stanley. I'm not Beth Moore. I'm not Nikki Gumbel. I'm not all these great folks that we watch and we compare ourselves to. But it's amazing. I don't think God wants you to be those people. He wants you to be you. So when it comes to God and even faith, I think many people, and And maybe it happens for us. You may have entertained some thoughts like this, that I'm not really necessary to what God's doing. Yeah, God's doing a thing, but I don't know that I'm necessarily that much of a key player. I don't even know if I'm that much of a key player to the church and moving it on. And sometimes I feel like maybe, the ministry of Jesus Christ doesn't really even need me. It's going to go on. Even if I disappear and I wasn't even here in this community and I wasn't in this worship, it wouldn't really make a difference. And some people might add, you know what? I wonder if it would really make a difference if I hadn't even been born. So I gave you the hits of 64 with the Beatles. Now I'm going to give you the hits of the 40s. What am I referring to? Did you remember the movie? I think it was 1947. It's a Wonderful Life. Remember that movie? It was amazing. We had most of the children, not all of them, most of the students come at the first service and they sit over here. And I know they've never seen this movie, so I really was encouraging them to maybe go and watch it. It's an old movie. It's black and white. But I said, hey, it's got some great questions and a really way of sorting out life. It's a little bit sorting out life, addressing Paul's questions. So George Bailey in this Wonderful Life, he feels like a nowhere man. If you've seen the movie, to the point of wishing he was never born. So he attempts to end his life. Isn't it funny? It's a Christmas movie about somebody who's kind of wants to end life. Instead, he's given this vision of really what the world truly would have been like without him.
It would have been better if I'd never been born at all.
What'd you say?
I said I wish I'd never been born.
You've got your wish. You've never been born. A chance to see what the world would be like without you.
Now, you're Ernie Bishop, and you live in Bailey Park with your wife and kid. That's right, isn't it?
I live in a shack in Potter's Field, and I ain't never seen you before in my life.
I'm going home and see my wife and family.
This house ain't been lived in for 20 years.
Your brother, Harry Bailey, broke through the ice and was drowned at the age of 9. You weren't there to save Harry. Strange, isn't it? Each man's life touches so many other lives. You really had a wonderful life. Don't you see what a mistake it would be to throw it away?
Get me back. I don't care what happens to me. I want to live again.
So the end of this movie, if you want, that's just a trailer, but if you want to actually watch the movie, and if you've watched it, you know that George Bailey discovered something wonderful, that his living presence, the very fact that he was in the world, and he was in that town, and in that community, made a difference, a huge difference, because he was necessary. He was necessary to far more people than he could even imagine. If you removed his life, people's lives were changed, but not for the better. In fact, their lives didn't reach the fuller capacity that they would have had he been alive and living. The fullness and joy and hope that he helped being a part of promoting. So here's one of the takeaways is we count in God's plan for the fullness of life, not only for ourselves, that's a wonderful thing, but the better thing is it's for others. God thinks we are necessary to live Christ right now. Because no matter where you are, if you're in jail like Paul, maybe you have hardships in life, doesn't matter. You're necessary to someone, and you're especially necessary to God. So just reiterating that lesson of George Bailey is that he learned that there was a life worth living. There was a winning life. And that part of that was that there was a necessity for his life in the world. So this, in the same way, I hope you can make this transition, because in the same way, you're just as necessary. And here's why. We live in an ever-increasing, biblically illiterate culture. What do I mean by that? You know, fewer and fewer people come to church. It's a national trend. Not in all nations, but it is in ours right now. Fewer young people are joining in Christian formation groups. Sunday school, I'll just tell you right now, Sunday school in the mainline churches and even the non-denominational churches, people are considering doing away with it because people don't want it. People don't come. Parents don't bring their kids. So if you put all those things together, what you have, a few more generations of that, and we will have a majority of people that are biblically illiterate in this country. And it'll have an impact on our nation. Because if truth is relative and we don't know where to trust and where to place our feet, what'll hold the community together? And maybe the problem is that this fraying that I sense, and I think you do too, this fraying as a society is going on because some of the foundations are breaking a bit. They're more like little islands in a frozen lake. You know, we're all on a little island floating, and we're unattached. And that's very unsettling to folks. So the sky's not falling, and there is an answer to this emerging culture that is taking place right now. But it's not new. That's what's so wonderful about Scripture and not being biblically illiterate. We can turn back to Scripture and say, this has all happened before. Paul went through this 2,000 years ago. Same thing, it appeared to many that the foundations that held the world together were all breaking apart. So now what? You're necessary. You're even more necessary because of what's going on right now. To live as Christ, that's the call. So again, it's so large. It's so hard to, it's just not very tangible, is it? So let me say it in a more relatable language. I'm echoing what I said last week by saying we could be a part of making Jesus more accurately known. I said that last week. More accurately known. Because we are becoming a biblically illiterate society. If you ask people today, some people will say, oh, church and Jesus, that's for the older generations. You know, that's kind of that's their thing, and we're into something else. If you certain age cohorts, if you ask them about the church, they'll say, well, I don't come anymore, or I don't want to come, because the church is basically full of hypocrites. That's biblically illiterate, because we confess that we're broken. That's why we're here. Nothing hypocritical about that at all. Some say Jesus in the church, it's not part of my life goals. You know, I have some life goals I'm working out, but that one doesn't, it's just not a big one. It's not that important. And we would say a life worth living can't really be fully achieved unless Jesus in church is part of those life goals. But again, we live kind of a biblically illiterate culture that's being raised up right now. The last one is the church is too restrictive. You know, in the NFL, they find a lot of ways to describe the letters NFL, and one of it is the No Fun League. You've heard that before if you're a football fan. But I think there's some NFL going on in the church. No fun liturgy. People say, "Oh, it's too boring for me. I don't get it. It's no fun." So could the tension in our country that we're feeling right now and seeing on TV be related somewhat to this falling church attendance and active faith? The less people are together as the community of faith, it lessens the impact that we can have on the community. So maybe we need to be reintroducing love into the world. Again, biblically illiterate culture will say, oh, Christians are about, they just don't like people. And it's the exact opposite. We love people. And we need to reintroduce that love. And a love for Jesus, for God's sake. And because we care about people. You have people that you care about. And if you care about them deeply enough, you'll do almost anything for them. And that's what was going on with Paul. He loved those people. He wanted to help them. He didn't want them to stay where they were. He wanted them to have a winning life right then. So it was on behalf of their needs that Paul said it's necessary. My living right now is necessary. So how will people discover this. Discover the love of Christ. Discover a winning life. How can others discover a winning life if they don't even know how to get there? If they're just basically nowhere men and women that don't even know a pathway. They're on these paths, they're living a path to nowhere, nowhere land. They make plans, but they're really for no one because they don't have anything substantial behind them that really makes a difference, especially for a winning life. And especially when no one, at least few, seem to care about them. You're necessary to these people. You can invite them to listen. You can help them see there's a real life. There's a full life. There's a meaningful life. And they may be unaware of it. They may be biblically illiterate, and they've made it into something that is not at all. They're missing a life worth living, and it's just within their reach. Now, we don't have to be perfect Christians, super Christians. I think that's sometimes it's defense to keep us from doing anything, and sometimes I think we just believe it. I'm not like those super Christians. I can't have that kind of effect. Well, here's the truth. You don't have to be saints. We just need to be able to show enough of Jesus for folks to look at us and see Him, to see there's a better life, a life that actually is worth living. And the amazing thing is this. When we do these things, we get motivated in this way to see that we're necessary, we make a difference. When we put Christ in the center, we exalt Jesus Christ, our lives become more meaningful. You can do it to help others, but the wonderful thing is the more you do it to help others, the more you feel it in your own life of having meaning. We realize our necessity to Jesus, and then we step out into a life that's truly worth living. And we're given tools for